Oh, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
there we go. Hey.
All right, cool.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, let's get started.
All right. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to talk about this data structure called open hypergraphs. And they're basically a data structure for representing syntax. And you'd use it where you'd use a tree, except where your terms are more kind of circuit-like. So I've got this picture, this F and G thing on the top here, and that, you can kind of think of that as the term x squared, right? So it has this operation f, which is going to copy its input, and the white operation is going to multiply its two inputs together, and so it takes some x and gives you x squared. And the difference with trees, obviously, is like your operations can have multiple outputs. So sort of this multiple input, multiple output thing very naturally. And there's some data parallel algorithms for constructing these things algebraically, so by tensor and composition in a category, but also differentiating. So that's what's pictured in the big complicated diagram on the bottom. That's what I mean by a derivative of that diagram. But the headline is really that this transformation from the top to the bottom is kind of like an ahead of time autodiff algorithm, and you get a symbolic term out of it. And this is kind of talked about in this paper, data parallel algorithms for string diagrams, but there's some other stuff floating around as well. I'm not going to talk about category theory too much, but the one thing I do want to say is that when I say a term, what I mean is a morphism in the strict symmetric monoidal category freely generated by some signature. But in sort of normal human language, what that means is you have some set of objects, and think of these as like types. So for example, you might have a type of integers, and some set of operations. So here we have like copy and multiply, and you just sort of plot these operations down on the page, and you wire them up however you like. But when you do this, it is actually the case that these things form a category. This data structure is like kind of directly from the math, so to speak. Now this data structure, sort of abstractly, open hypergraphs, cospans of hypergraphs, have been known about for a while. It's kind of folkloric. I know it from this really nice series of papers, String Diagram Rewrite Theory. But this talk is really about a very specific representation of these hypergraphs, which like works well for GPUs. So it's all very data parallel. And so I'm going to tell you about the data structure, talk about these algorithms for constructing it, and then finally how to take derivatives of these things. So going back to our x squared term, that's this string diagram here. My mouse showing up? Good. This thing below is kind of a depiction of the data structure. And there's a few different things going on. So you have these blue boxes, and these are representing the sort of dangling wires here. You have these black nodes inside this gray box, and these are the hypernodes of the hypergraph. The white boxes are hyperedges, and the nodes correspond to wires of your diagram. So this 0 node here is the input wire. This 1 node here is this top wire here. And the hyperedges correspond to your operations. And so just down here are the sort of concrete numbers in this particular representation. So each hyperedge has a list of sources, so the source nodes sort of feeding into it, and the target nodes to which it writes. And it also has a label saying what operation it is. And so the sort of naive approach to represent this is you have, for each hyperedge, you have a tuple of its sources, its targets, and its label. I should mention these are ordered lists. It's really important they're ordered because obviously if you, in a general operation, if you swap the order, then it might do something different. And this is kind of an array of structs representation, which is not super nice for GPUs. So the obvious thing to do is use a struct of arrays. And that's exactly what this is. So the actual concrete data structure is just these 8 arrays here. The bottom 2 are segmented arrays. I'll talk about that in a sec. But we have an array of labels, W. So all the wires in our diagram they're labeled with the object in the category, or like the type. So in this case, we only have ints. The operation, each operation also has a label, so copy and multiply. Then we have a list of nodes that are inputs. So we have 0 as the input node, 3 as the output node. And then lastly, we have this thing of sources and targets. And these are just concatenations of the previous sources and target arrays we already saw. So when I said a segmented array, what I mean is really a pair of arrays, where the bottom is a concatenation of some arrays, and the top is just a list of sizes, basically. So that's the representation. Now we need 2 operations on it for it to form a category. We need tensor and composition. Tensor is just stacking, right? So if we stack copy over multiply, we get something like this, which copies its first input and multiplies its second 2 inputs. And then composition is you feed the outputs of one thing into the inputs of the other. And to just quickly sketch the way this works and why it's data parallel, that's kind of the thing I'm trying to convey here. This tensor is just array concatenation with some renumbering. And the renumbering is very easy, you just add an offset. So if you look at the sort of input arrays here, there's two of them, you just sort of squish them together. But of course, we've renumbered the wires in the right-hand side of this. And basically, all the label arrays you just concatenate. Any of the arrays involving indices to wires, you have to do this renumbering, but it's very easy. It's completely data parallel. In fact, you should be able to do it in constant time if you have enough processors. Then composition, you first do a tensoring. So that's what I've pictured on the top here. And then you do an identification of wires. So this is basically saying you put all the diagrams into one big diagram, and then you identify the bits that got glued together on the boundaries. And then, of course, you also need to delete the parts of the interfaces that shouldn't really be exposed anymore. So here we're gluing the outputs of F into the inputs of G, so we identify 1 with 3, 2 with 4. And the way you do this identification is by connected components, and that's pretty fast on a sequential machine. It's linear time, but it's also very fast on a parallel machine. It runs in logarithmic time, so it speeds up. It's data parallel. And in general, there's actually an algorithm to construct one of these things from a general tree. So if you have a tree like F compose G, tensor H, the nodes are compose or tensor. And the obvious thing to do is this just sort of inductive thing where you use your tensor and compose algorithms. This is very slow because you're doing n linear operations, so that's not good. But instead, the trick is you tensor all the leaves together, and then you use connected components to wire it all up at the end. It runs nice and fast. But the point about doing this wiring all at the end is that, this is a trick we use pretty much everywhere in the code, including for the autodiff stuff. And before I talk about autodiff, I have to tell you about this condition, monogamous acyclicity. So earlier I said you plop your operations down on the page and you wire them up however you like. That doesn't actually work. That doesn't get you a morphism in the category, so I lied. It gets you a morphism in a different category with some extra structure. I'll show that in a minute. But if you want a genuine morphism in the category generated by your signature, you need this monogamous acyclicity condition. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's fairly simple. It forbids things like I've pictured here. And of course, it's preserved by tensor and composition. So if you build something inductively, then it's still sort of within the category. Now, if you don't have this condition, the extra structure you get is this special Frobenius structure. So it's these 4 operations plus some equations which are not pictured. But now I can show you the term corresponding to that weird open hypergraph I showed you. And you can see that you can do sort of feedback, you can bend wires backwards, you can split wires, you can join wires. And part of this structure is going to be very useful for doing the autodiff. So in particular, being able to bend wires backwards is going to let us have information flowing from left to right in the kind of forward pass of your neural network and right to left in the sort of gradient reverse pass. So to be clear about what I mean by taking a derivative, I mean computing a reverse derivative of a morphism. So this is defined in this paper, reverse derivative categories. It's a very nice paper. I did a kind of inductive version of this with string diagrams, but the sort of TLDR for the purpose of this talk is for every operation in your category, if you have some f a to b, you also need a reverse derivative, which goes from the input a, the output gradient b, and it will give you an input gradient a. And they compose by the chain rule. The problem is the chain rule has both f and r of f in it. So the way this is compositional is actually as a pair of f and r of f. And this is actually a lens, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. And it seems like if we want to compose things in this way, we're going to have to take our diagram, break it down into its constituent primitive operations, and then inductively build it back up. But as we already know, this is like n squared. This is not fast. So what we want is something which is linear time, or logarithmic, if we can get logarithmic in parallel. And we don't want to use this inductive approach. So we can use optic composition. And the sort of intuition for this is, like I mentioned earlier, your sort of data flows from left to right, and your gradients flow from right to left. So an optic has sort of 3 things: a forward map, a reverse map, and this residual communication between them, M. And in terms of PyTorch, actually it lines up very, very nicely with PyTorch, where you might write a forward map. So this is for multiply, taking x1, x2, multiply them together. That's the output. And you also have this residual communication where you save x1 and x2 for the reverse pass. Now your backward map takes that context. So this would be x1 and x2 on these wires, and it will multiply your gradient output coming in here by x2 and also by x1 on the second output wire. So what does that actually look like as a diagram? Now we use the special Frobenius structure to construct this thing. So you can sort of see that what's down here is actually an input, and it sort of loops around here, feeds back into the backwards map, G backwards. And similarly, this down here on the bottom left is an output. So the thing to note here is this is actually not monogamously cyclic because we use this Frobenius structure. And so it's not a term in our original category. We can fix that though. And the way that we fix that is by adding this extra, we can just bend those wires around basically. So here's a kind of picture of differentiating our x squared term. And you map your f to its forward and reverse components. You map your g to its forward and reverse components. You obviously have to connect the residuals up. These things now compose together, as in this diagram, so you just sort of plug them together like that. And then you have to bend around the wires at the bottom so that this here is actually an output, and this here is actually an input. And I guess if I want to try and convince you informally, if you take those bottom two wires and you pull them, all the Frobenius structure will disappear. It's like when you see someone tie a knot and they pull it and the knot disappears. It's a bit like that. So just to try and convince you that this is that computing this diagram is actually data parallel, the sort of basic thing is for each operation fi in your input term, you compute its forward map and you sort of stack these up. That's basically just a map over an array. You do the same with your reverse maps. You have to do a bit of funky wiring here. But that's basically it. And now you have something sort of the right shape. There's a bit of extra bookkeeping involved, but that's basically the idea. So what can you actually build with that? Obviously, the example I gave you is very, very simple. But if you take as your sort of generating operations tensor shapes, and you're generating objects tensor shapes, and you're generating operations, things like matrix multiplication, things like this. Then you have a differentiable array language. And we have essentially just enough here to train like a simple GPT model, so nano GPT in this case. There's some other stuff I'm not going to talk about to leave time for questions, but ask me if you like. Yeah, and that's basically it. We're sort of working on this at my company, Hellas. We're hiring, so shameless plug at the end. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So any questions in the audience?
Right. Thank you. So you're saying the differentiation on the circuits is something that can happen in a data parallel manner, and the construction of the circuit out of the syntax can be done in a data parallel manner. So for what sort of applications do you think that is important? Because I always imagined this being a compile time thing. Yeah. Or do you imagine doing this sort of transformation at runtime and on a GPU?
So one thing I wanted to do, which I've not got around to, is if you're doing program search and you have very large terms and you want to do a lot of these things, then it becomes sort of in the loop. And so you need to be able to differentiate these things. And specifically what I'm thinking about here are circuits. So we're trying to find good circuit models where you're using some notion of differentiation. And also, I should mention, because this is optic composition, really, it's not really an autodiff algorithm. It's an optic composition algorithm. It generalizes to other things as well that are sort of optic shaped, like, I hope, incremental computation and some other things. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, I have a very high level, maybe silly question. So what was the reason to start working on this? Was it motivated by a specific application in mind, or?
It was partly the desire to do differentiation of string diagrams, and specifically with an eye to doing this circuit thing, but also kind of a general ideological attempt to do everything with string diagrams.
All right.
So, yeah.
All right. Okay. Oh wow, that calls 2 extra questions. Let's take them.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, can you use this to prove optimizations on circuits, like rewrite rules to simplify the circuits?
Sorry, what you mean? What's the goal you're trying to prove exactly?
Like you can compile whatever you want into a circuit, and can you, I don't know, like came up with some rewrite rules to simplify the circuits, like to do some kind of optimization?
Oh, I mean, rewriting is not something I've looked at, but like the theory of rewriting these things is like fairly well known. There's some software to do it. I think Chip by Alex Kissinger. But
right. But you are not. Are you doing that with your?
We're not doing
no.
rewriting, but it's like possible in principle. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I have a question on the functions you can differentiate, because it seems that there is a correspondence here between the string diagram and the function. And for a Frobenius structure, I could see a polynomial, but if I want a more complicated function, does it make sense to describe it as a string diagram, and what would that look like?
I mean, the most complicated function that I've applied this to is GPT-2. So, but in terms of like features, like for example, higher order functions are not something that I handle right now. I don't know how you do that in principle, but there's better people in this room to ask, which I plan to. And things like loops, you'd have to unroll your loop first. But I think there's probably a nice categorical way to describe this. Does that answer your question?
It does answer part of it. I'm curious on the. I'll ask you later too, but I'm curious on like what the categorical structure looks like. That.
Okay. I mean, I have ideas, but yeah.